We hear a ton about companies making these huge climate pledges, hitting net zero, slashing emissions. But all of that, every single promise, it all has to start with one really fundamental question. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. I mean, really think about it. How does some massive global company with factories, offices, and supply chains stretching all across the planet even begin to add up its climate impact? It's definitely not as simple as just reading a single meter. It takes a standardized global rulebook that everyone can agree on. So here's our roadmap. First, we're going to dig into why companies even do this. Then we'll check out the global rulebook they all use. And after that, we'll break down exactly how it works, from figuring out your footprint to actually using that data to make a change. Let's kick things off with the why. All right, first up, why bother with all this? Well, it turns out that counting carbon is no longer just some, feel-good environmental exercise. In today's world, it is an absolutely critical business function with some very, very real financial stakes. So what does good carbon accounting actually do for a business? Well, for starters, it helps them manage risks, especially with all the new climate policies popping up. It also helps them spot opportunities to be more efficient and save money. It's the essential data you need to report to investors, to comply with mandatory government programs, and to get some credit for actually taking climate action. And believe me, this isn't just some abstract idea. We're talking about major companies like Ford, who rely on this standard every single day. For them, it created a solid, dependable way to track their emissions and really manage their climate strategy. It basically turns a ridiculously complex problem into something they can actually manage.
Okay, so if every company needs to count its emissions, they all need to be playing by the same set of rules, right? And that brings us to the global rulebook for all of this, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol.
The easiest way to think about the GHG protocol is to compare it to financial accounting. It's basically the GAAP, the generally accepted accounting principles, but for greenhouse gases instead of dollars and cents. It was created by this partnership between the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, specifically to create one single, credible standard that everybody, everywhere, can trust.
And that trust? It's built on these 5 core principles. Just like with money, greenhouse gas accounting has to be relevant to the business, it has to be complete, consistent over time, totally transparent in its methods, and of course, accurate. This rigor is what makes the final numbers mean something.
All right, let's switch gears and get into the practical side of things. How does this actually work? Well, the very first thing a company has to do is answer a pretty simple question. What exactly is the company? This step is called setting your organizational boundaries. So a company basically has 2 ways to define itself, and it boils down to a really straightforward choice. Do you count the stuff you own or the stuff you run? The equity share approach is all about ownership. If you own, say, 40% of a factory, you count 40% of its emissions. Simple. The control approach, on the other hand, is about power. If you have operational control over that factory, you count 100% of its emissions. Doesn't matter if you only own a tiny piece of it. So once you've defined who you are as a company, the next step is to figure out what you're actually counting. And this brings us to probably the most famous concept from the GHG protocol, the 3 scopes of emissions. Now, before we can really dive into the 3 scopes, we got to get one fundamental idea straight: the difference between direct and indirect emissions. Direct emissions, those come from sources you literally own or control. Indirect emissions are a bit trickier. They're a consequence of your company's activities, but the actual greenhouse gases are being released somewhere else, at a place someone else owns or controls. Okay, so scope 1. This is the most straightforward one. These are your direct emissions. We're talking about the gas being burned in your factory's furnaces, the fuel that's powering your fleet of company trucks, the emissions from chemical processes happening right there on site. It's the stuff you are directly responsible for right then and there. Next up, scope 2. This covers a very specific kind of indirect emission: the energy you buy. Think about it. Your office lights are on, but the emissions from making that electricity aren't happening inside your building. They're happening miles away at a power plant. But because you bought that power, because you're the one using it, you are responsible for a slice of those emissions. That's scope 2. And then there's scope 3. Phew! Scope 3 is the big one. It's this huge catch-all category for all other indirect emissions, both up and down your entire value chain. This means emissions from your suppliers who are making your raw materials, emissions from your employees flying for business trips, and get this, even emissions from your customers using the products you sell.
It is by far the most comprehensive and often the hardest to calculate. So let's put it all together. Let's say you're a car company. Scope 1 is the emissions from the smokestacks at your assembly plant. Scope 2 is the emissions from the power company that's generating the electricity to run that plant. And Scope 3? Well, that's everything else. From the emissions created to make the steel that you buy, all the way to the emissions coming out of the tailpipe when a customer drives that car off the lot. See? The whole shebang. So, you've done all the hard work. You've defined your boundaries. You've sorted your emissions into scopes 1, 2, and 3. You've got a number. But a single number by itself isn't really a strategy, is it? The real power comes when you start tracking that number over time.
And to do that, you need a starting line. In the world of carbon accounting, this is called your base year. It's a specific historical year that you pick as your benchmark. Every single thing you do from that point on gets compared back to this base year to see if you're actually making progress. You can't really know if you're winning the race if you don't know where the starting line was.
But what happens if the company itself changes? Like, what if you buy a new factory? Obviously, your emissions are going to go up. Well, to keep things fair, to make sure it's always a like-for-like comparison, the protocol says you have to go back and recalculate your base year emissions as if you owned that factory all along. It ensures you're always comparing apples to apples. You know, when you boil it all down, the entire reason for this incredibly detailed, rigorous accounting process comes down to this classic management principle. The GHG protocol gives companies the tools to measure their impact in a credible, consistent way. Because once you can actually measure it, you can finally begin to manage it.
Which, of course, leaves us with the final and most important question of all. This entire framework, all this work, it's designed to give companies the reliable data they need to take action. The accounting is the means, not the end. The real work starts right here. Once you know how to count your carbon, how do you actually start to cut it? And that, right there, is the multi-trillion-dollar question defining corporate climate strategy today.